if I would summarize what's going on there, it would be this, that the remainder of the scrutinies after the seven sermons is dedicated to establishing a level ground between the human and the divine, between mankind, humanity, the human being consciousness, human consciousness, and the divine powers, to establishing a level ground between them. He wants to put this on an even ground. Now, you could say what has happened to Jung in the Red Book is that his confidence, his ego standing, has increased tremendously from the beginning, where he's very small and Elijah and Salome are huge powers and he's afraid of them. Now he's up to talking back to the gods, including Abraxas, any of them, and tells the soul he's not willing to submit in obedience to the gods anymore, to the divine powers, to the mystery. Now there's a famous dream. I think David Tresen's there somewhere too in California watching this. If you are, David, this is for you. A famous dream that David has made a lot of, and he and I have discussed, and other people have written about, where Jung reports in Memories, Dreams, Reflections that he's with his father, and they're in a Muslim sanctuary, in a temple, and they're bowing their heads to a deity power that's in the wall above. And Jung's father's head goes to the ground, and Jung's head goes toward the ground. He says, but it doesn't touch the ground. There is maybe a millimeter to spare. Now, this stubbornness on Jung's part not to submit in complete and unquestioning obedience to the powers, the authorities, but to stand up and talk to them and discuss with them and try to create a dialogic relationship in which both sides of the dialogue are going to be equal partners in change, is a movement toward a kind of theology that you see in modern times in process theology, for instance, where there is this notion that human consciousness and the divine interact with each other and both change as a result, and it's all a process. It comes from Whitehead's philosophy and what are called process theologians that appeared in the 60s and 70s. Jung's is a very early anticipation of that idea of a process between human consciousness and whatever else is out there, extraterrestrial aliens or the divine mystery, to give the human a footing to speak from and to stand on. And this building up of a strong enough position you see going on in the Red Book over and over again, where he builds a tower and the Kabiroi from underneath help him, and he makes a castle that is solid and firm, and building a state of consciousness that is connected to the self and that can relate to the other on an equal basis. Then there is a number of very interesting passages in which Christ appears. Twice Christ appears. Philemon welcomes Christ. He comes as a shade. He's just called a shade. He enters in, and Philemon bows to him, and Philemon greets him as my Lord and my brother, and praises him to the high heavens for all that he's done and given to humanity, endless amounts of love and compassion, sacrificing himself, giving and giving. And in recognition of that, Philemon says that now you've given enough, and the time of your giving is over. We're entering a new month. This is a reference to the age of Aquarius. We're entering a new month in which every human being is going to have to do their own work. Instead of wanting you to do it for them, looking to you to save them, they're going to have to do the work for themselves. Mankind has to grow up and take responsibility. Mind you, he's saying this during the First World War, which he sees as a total insanity. and people doing things because they're told to do them. Why don't people just stop killing each other? It's madness. So mankind has to grow up, take responsibility. You can't. The Nuremberg trials said you can't get off just because the authorities told you to do it. Too bad. If you know it's wrong, say it's wrong. Refuse to do it. Be a refusenik. So you die. So you go to prison. Grow up, and don't expect Christ to save you in the end after you've committed all kinds of abominations and sins. And then you get some kind of cheap grace. This was Dietrich Bonhoeffer's phrase, cheap grace. This is a diatribe against cheap grace. So what Jung is advocating is human beings to grow up, take responsibility, and not just put it off conveniently onto somebody else who will forgive them for their sins, and so they can remain defensive and unconscious for the rest of their lives. And the very final scene of Scrutinies, again, Christ comes. Jung says, I went into my garden on a warm summer afternoon, and Philemon appeared under a tree, and then the shade came, and again it's Christ, and they welcome Christ, and they greet Christ, and Christ says, whose garden is this? Is this my garden? You know, he walked through the garden alone. Is this the Garden of Gethsemane, or is this the garden of the other world? Philemon says, no, this is our garden. This is my garden and his garden. And Christ says, well, I thought I owned all the gardens. And Philemon says, no, that's in eternity. This is this world. This is the world of humans. We own this garden. You're our guest. Okay? So Christ is the guest now. And they honor him, and they recognize him, and they thank him. And the very last words of the Scrutinies, they ask Christ, and what do you bring us? They said, we welcomed the worm, and he brought us horror and abomination. The worm is the devil, and he brought the war and horrible things that are going on. What do you bring us? And Christ says, I bring you the beauty of suffering. And anyone who welcomes the worm and can bear the worm will receive my gift, the beauty of suffering. And that's the end of Scrutinies. So Christ is definitely honored, but he's relieved of his duties, okay, in this new age that is now dawning, the new month, as Jung calls it. Everybody has to take up the burden for himself. In answer to Job, he writes about the Christification of many. Everybody has to become a Christ. Everybody has to carry the cross. Everybody has to carry their own burden, take responsibility for their own deeds, suffer their own sins, and live it to the end. You can't put it off on somebody else and get by on cheap grace. So that's the message, the final message at the end of the Scrutinies, which is a tough book. And I guess if we take it to heart, and our field takes it to heart, we can't blame anybody else for our problems. We have to take on the burden of our suffering ourselves. I think the way of analytical psychology is like Jung's, the way of the solitary. It's never going to be the big mass movement. We're never going to have conferences of 100,000 members like the APA or other great associations in the collective. I think we'll always be a minority, but I think that's a distinction. If we can be a good minority, if we can be a faithful minority, if we can be a minority who really holds up high standards and good quality, then we're doing our work. And we shouldn't blame the insurance companies because they don't pay us our fees, and we shouldn't blame governments because they change our laws, and we just have to take responsibility for ourselves. I think that's one message of this. On a religious side, I think human beings have to grow up, whether you stay in the Christian church or not. The Pope is starting to grow up. Take responsibility for your group, you know, face it. And on recent reports, he's starting to do that. These priests who've been abusing children can't get by with cheap grace anymore. They have to face the music. So that's the message. On a religious side, grow up. If you want to have faith, do it in an adult way and do it with responsibility, and not as a kind of childish belief system that gives you comfort and lets you off the hook.